Okie dokie, let's do this. Hello everyone, welcome to another Meyer Sound webinar. How's the transmission? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Excellent, thank you for confirming, Oscar. We have a busy schedule today, so without further ado, let's start looking at the household notes first, for which I will share my screen. So today is another episode about theater sound. Very excited about it. But before we're going to look at the actual content and introduce our guest lecturers, we're first going to look at the household notes. So we're using the Zoom video communication platform, which means that in front of you, you are expected to have a window not unlike the one you see over here. If you would like to see who else is joining you on today's webinar, you can click on the participants button. Whenever you do that, a window pops up on the right side showing you your fellow attendees. We encourage you to ask questions also during the session, but in order to do so in an organized fashion, we would like you to make use of the raise hand feature. Notice that in the bottom right corner, there is a button which says raise hand. Whenever you click that button, a blue hand icon pops up in the corner of my eye, informing me that you're about to ask a question. At which point I will try to find a white space in the lecturer's narrative and briefly interrupt him to pose your question. Now, in order to ask your question itself, we encourage you to make use of the chat functionality. To activate the chat, all you have to do is click on the balloon icon, in which case the right-hand window splits in half, showing a new chat dialog. There's a field at the bottom of this window where you can enter a message and address the nation, that's to say everyone on the call, or if you happen to see a colleague, a friend, or a fellow family member, then you can also address that person in private. As you have come to expect of us, we're currently also simulcasting to the Facebook Live user group, and that means welcome to those that are joining us there as well. The user group currently counts over 8,900 members and growing, so welcome and thank you for joining us. And that means that for those that have been keeping track of our webinars, we've done several webinars on theater sound. Bob McCarthy has taken us on a historical journey where we also saw our guest lecturers of today. And same goes for Tony Miola last Monday. So if you have an interest in theater sound, be sure to watch those webinars, which can be found on our Thinking Sound YouTube channel, Meyer Sound's Thinking Sound YouTube channel. To which you see all relevant information here. This is going to be another episode where the precision toolset comes into the equation. Of course, all the systems that we're about to see have been designed with MAP, and they use Galaxy devices, which they control with the Compass control software, walking the room using their iPad, while voicing the system using their iPad, using Compass Go. Walking the room. Of course, these systems are being monitored. Their health is being monitored using the RM server and such, and power distribution goes without saying. And a lot of the products that we discussed will show up during today's webinar, all being part of our turnkey solution known as the Precision Toolset. Today, I have a co-host like we had on Monday, which is John Monitto, our Director of Business Development and Sales Manager for the American Northeast. John, are you with us?
I am.
Excellent.
Thanks, Merlijn.
Excellent. So, John, if I'm not mistaken, you brought some guests as well.
I did. We're very excited to have with us Lane Elms from Berkeley Repertory Theater, Peter Hylenski, and Simon Matthews. And I'm really excited about today's webinar.
So here we see Peter, and here we see Lane, and finally Simon. Sorry, I had to make sure that we can all see each other, so I had to briefly operate Zoom because that's, as a moderator, that's part of the job description. So John, what are we discussing first?
So I'm going to start with a little talk about just kind of an introduction. I mean, the designers that we have today have worked on plays, musicals, and really kind of the idea of today's webinar is to focus really on what they're trying to achieve in their design work, and the venues that they're working in, and talk a little bit about the importance of acoustics in these venues. And I've had conversations with Lane and Pete and Simon many times over the years, and I thought it would be great to bring it into one of our webinars during this theater series, and really kind of focus on not only, I mean, Pete's got some exciting stuff that he's going to also share about some incredible shows that he's done to create a very immersive acoustic, but also talk about what goes on when you really focus in on making sure that the moment happens right to be able to achieve the right type of theater design that they're working on. So I think we're going to start with Lane, and a little bit about what goes on at this theater that was recently renovated at Berkeley Rep. I think it was done right before Lane started, the Pete's Theater, and where they did some renovation on the acoustics as well as adding a Constellation system into that space. So
so before we do that, shall we briefly check communication, whether all microphones are working? So Peter, Lane, Simon, are you with us?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, 10-4.
Thanks for having me.
And Peter?
Hey guys, Simon.
Excellent. And I think we also heard Simon.
I'm sure you did.
Yes, welcome.
And I should be live as well.
Yes, sir.
Great.
I really want to thank you guys for joining us today. This is going to be an amazing hour.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Or hour and a half, maybe.
Yeah, thank you to Meyer Sound for having the ability to put these on. This is great conversation and a great way for us all to discuss and learn.
Absolutely. So Lane, you graduated from North Carolina School of the Arts. You worked at the Alliance Theater for a bit. You did some tours of plays and musicals. The Signature Theater you worked at for a number of years, then La Jolla, and now Berkeley Rep. And the interesting thing about Pete's Theater is this whole renovation that happened. And I know that you didn't really experience this theater before the renovation, but can you talk a little bit about what's been happening in this space?
Sure. So, so as you can see, this is the Pete's Theater. I think the most interesting thing about this space, especially since it's a small space, is that it's asymmetrical. It was originally designed in the 70s, and at that time, it certainly wouldn't have been designed for reinforcement sound systems. So a lot of the renovation really had to do with actually getting control in the space over that situation. I know a lot of acoustical treatment was added during the renovation, in addition to the Constellation system, which really sort of acts as the acoustics in the room now. That's really a great tool for us for a number of reasons. One is it really, and my favorite reason is that it really allows the sound designers coming in to play with a space in a unique way that that you might not be able to in more traditional acoustic spaces. So we've had, since I've been at Berkeley Rep for a little bit over a year, and many of the sound designers we've had in, Mikhail Suleiman and Charles Coase, and upcoming Kai Harada, have really sort of taken hold of the Constellation system and ran with it in terms of changing the acoustics of the space for the show. So I think we probably have a slide somewhere of the number of loudspeakers that we have in the Pete's Theater, but I believe off the top of my head it's near 100, and we have over 20 microphones that comprise the Constellation system, along with all of the Dimitri processing. And we pretty much use the Constellation system constantly. If there's anybody in the room, regardless of if it's just a company meeting, or, oh, there you go, 24 microphones. Regardless of whether or not it's a meeting, a company meeting, or or just a small lecture or anything, the Constellation system's on, and we're really able to tailor it to the needs of the event that's happening in there. Some of the more interesting things we've done in there is we had Charles Coase and Mark Bennett in for a show called Good Book last year, and they really took advantage of changing the acoustics in the space on a scene-by-scene basis. There were some sort of dreamy scenes where there was like flashback, and then we moved to a very reverberant space. with additional echoes and sort of some effects that were included in that, and then and then as we popped out of the dream sequence, we went back to sort of a normal voice lift room sound. So that's really the cool thing for us about having the Constellation system in there and the acoustics in the space. The other thing is that so during the renovation, since we added the Constellation system, one of the objectives was to really be able to control the acoustics completely within the room. So making the room without the system pretty dead. And we succeeded at that pretty well. You can see along the whole back wall there by the booth is acoustic paneling. And then by where the proscenium is, you can see the house left wall over there is also mostly acoustic paneling, as well as acoustic paneling in the ceiling. So the room is actually pretty dead. And it's really fun to play a trick on people when they walk in with the Constellation system on, and then you pull out your iPad and suddenly turn it off, and then all of the energy is sucked out of the room. So that's one of my fun tricks to play on people for sure.
Awesome. Do you utilize Space Map as well in the space?
We do use Space Map. The thing is, we don't really change the speaker plot a lot. So mostly it's just about giving the information to the designers as they come in, and then we use it when we add. We do have to add loudspeakers over stage for most shows, and then depending on the designer, they might want to add additional additional coverage for specific things in the show. We also do a lot of the other thing, since we're talking about acoustics, one thing that wasn't treated during the renovation was any of the backstage or upstage area. So while the house is very dead without the Constellation system on, the upstage wall is of course a cinder block wall. And then as you go off stage left and right, it's it's two cinder block walls that sort of can reverberate. Yeah, you can see we have soft goods up there because it does actually make it really difficult to use the space when there's not soft goods or scenery in place, because of the serious slapback that you get off of that back cinder block wall. But the nice thing is because it's not a symmetrical space, and so that back wall isn't necessarily perpendicular or parallel to the audience, any specific audience. It does kind of bounce around in a unique way, but I found that most of the time we end up having to put up acoustical treatment of some sort during load in and tech. And it's something that we definitely talk to the sound designers about before they come in, so that they can work with the scene designers to sort of work on that.
That's great. Thanks. What's interesting is that this was the original stage at Berkeley Rep for before they built Dorota many years ago. This was the only stage at Berkeley Rep, and everything was done in this theater. And then they built the proscenium, which kind of took them to another level in terms of what they could present. So it's been an interesting evolution to see this theater now being renovated and how it's being used now. So thank you. Thanks, Lane.
Yeah.
So over the years, Pete and I have had many conversations about acoustics, and as well as with Simon. I know when Frozen was going into the St. James Theater, there was a concern that Pete brought forward, that in terms of addressing that to kind of improve that space. And so I was wondering if Pete could talk a little bit about the St. James and some of the other shows that he's done. Also, his interest in utilizing good acoustics for shows that he's done, like Lend Me a Tenor and a few others. I think that Merlijn will show some of Pete's credits, which are incredibly extensive. It's a real honor having him on this webinar today, as well as Simon, who works closely with Pete.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think in our prep talk, as we were kind of discussing amongst ourselves some of the topics and some of the things, it became really apparent that much of what Lane is experiencing at his theater is the same as what we experience in the theaters that we're working in, Simon and I. One of the biggest differences for us is we're very transient. We we are nomadic and we wander in and out of these spaces. So our ability to change the acoustics can be limited at times. And there are really 4 main topics that I was thinking of when we were discussing acoustics for theater. And the first of that is noise floor, as you and I were talking about. The second is acoustic treatment, then the use of Constellation and the acoustically and creatively. So if we sort of jump to your first question there about acoustics in the theater, like the St. James is a great example. Simon and I had done maybe 4 or 5 shows in that theater before Frozen. So one of them is On a Clear Day. There's a playbill for it there. Another was Sideshow. We did Something Rotten in that theater. So there was quite a lot of experience. And each show that we did, we learned a bit more. We tried new things. We tried to use technology to help us. Bullets Over Broadway was also another show that we did in the St. James. So we were trying to harness the power of technology and the thought of cardioid subarrays and things like that. But it got to a certain point where we could not electroacoustically design our way out of the problems in the theater. So when Frozen was first announced to go into the St. James, I called up Meyer and had a great chat, because the company overall has participants that understand their products, the use of the speakers in the theater, but also acoustics. So Roger Schwenke came out to New York and we measured the theater. And what was great is a lot of the theories that Simon and I had we couldn't prove them just magically in our minds, but Roger's technology was able to show us exactly what we were experiencing and that we weren't crazy. So once we had a document that stated the measured anomalies in the room, most of which were in the low end, it's a barrel vaulted architectural circle almost. It's sort of the theater is transcribed within a circle. So a lot of the walls are curved and rounded, and there are quite a few severe reflections, but also the way that it holds low end is, as Roger said, it has 4 or 5 times more low end than a concert hall should have had in the same volume of space. So any sort of kick drum or bass material, program material that you're putting in the room just sat there for days. And a show like Frozen is rhythm driven in a lot of places. It has its orchestral moments, but anything, you take the famous song of Let It Go, it's got bass guitar driving its lines, and it's got kick drum driving its rhythm, and it just didn't feel controllable enough in the room. So through Roger's recommendation and with Disney's help, we were able to actually do acoustic treatment in the room, which is a bit rare for some Broadway houses, because it has to go through approval by theater owners. It has to go through budget approvals by the producers. They're going to have a say in how much they're willing to spend on acoustic treatment and how important they think it is. So we ended up mainly focusing on the low end taming of 50 hertz to 90 hertz really. But there was an extreme amount of 50 hertz in the room. And Roger had recommended some products, and we had a company come in. We discussed where we could put the materials and how it would still look appropriate in the theater. But you can see a lot of the walls in the photograph here, even this first slide, they're really hard plaster walls. And you combine that with the parabolic shape, and it definitely gets a bit tricky. So, when we're putting loudspeakers into these spaces, we're always conscious of surfaces, barriers, and boundaries, but there's only so much you can get away with and still get the sound where it needs to be. And in particular with low end, even though we tried controlling our low end with cardioid arrays and things like that, and fire, we tried just about all of it. It was really important for us to get back down to the fundamentals. So I think theater acoustics are great. Even in Moulin Rouge, we were able to, Moulin Rouge was an interesting case study, because the set itself that Derek McLean designed came out into the house and really encompassed the entire room. So his his thought was transforming the theater into the Moulin Rouge Club itself. And that included drapery, which was music to our ears. The Al Hirschfeld Theater has parallel plaster walls that basically run, the left and right walls are parallel plaster walls, both in the upper level and in the lower level. And as soon as they were discussing adding drapery and covering the walls with drapery, it really gave us something to work off of. And Simon and I, there's a nice picture of Simon. Simon and I were able to work with the scenic team and with the production management team to hide acoustic treatment in the walls, behind the fabric coverings of the walls, and just strategically think about what we're trying to fight. What is the acoustic battle we're fighting? And in this case, it was those parallel reflective walls, and really pinpoint our funds. In this slide here, you can see some of the drapes that they were rigging to fly in the theater. And this is all in the house, not over the stage. So it really started to control the space and give us as Lane was saying in the Pete's Theater, that acoustically dead environment gives you something to work from when you're putting your program material into the room. So in the case of Moulin Rouge, these drapes and the acoustic treatment in the walls gave us some control. We certainly weren't looking for it to be completely dead because we weren't able to put a Constellation system in, but we wanted something that gave us a bit more control for a rhythm-based show. So I think those are two good examples of being able to modify the acoustics in a theater. Sometimes it's just locally putting a few panels of treatment somewhere where there's a problem spot. It's really about what you can do budgetarily, approval-wise, and such.
Are there two different systems in Moulin Rouge? I should know this, but in terms of the localization of, moments where there's dialogue and two people on stage, or there's multiple people on stage, as opposed to when the music happens, or when there's a big song. I know Moulin Rouge is full of music, so
there aren't two different systems, but the front end allows us to address the system differently through Dimitri and Galaxy. The way that we zone it is a little bit different depending on where the characters are. Gives us localization, so we've got cross-point matrix delay going on there, and then through the busing in the desk, we can put a character into a dialogue bus or a singing bus and change the scale of their voice, also change the processing of their voice. There's a number of parameters that can be adjusted based on, like you said, if they're singing versus dialogue. Especially in a pop show like this, what's often difficult is trying to make sure that the dialogue feels attached to the performers and feels in scale with what the performers are doing on stage. But as soon as that music kicks in, it needs to be pop and it needs to be produced. So how do you switch between? There have been systems in the past that we've done, Simon and I, where we've had two separate systems, either a vocal and a music system or something along those lines, and you can adjust scale that way. But it's there are many ways to achieve it as long as you're thinking that through. You certainly wouldn't want your vocals, perhaps, you might, but you might not want your vocals as big and compressed and what have you, processed in the dialogue sections.
Cool. So we talked Monday about this as well, but Pete, you and I have talked about noise floor in the theater and some of those challenges. Do you want to maybe address some of that concern and
Sure.
kind of where things have gone, and even in the evolution of your career, or from doing a play to a musical?
Yeah, I think that noise floor in live performance has always been something that we've had to contend with. And as you said, over the years, especially in my career, it's evolved and changed, mostly because of mechanics in the shows, be it automation, moving lights, projection, all technologies that up until recently required a lot of fans to cool their very hot lamps, or required, we didn't have enough knowledge as we were dealing with the automation. But I think it also includes HVAC which in a Broadway theater can definitely wreak havoc on the noise floor. And some of these noise pollutants, as we might call them, are seasonal, as in the HVAC. If you take a show during the winter time, the heating systems in a Broadway theater are largely steam, and the HVAC systems, which were all added later on in the lives of the theaters, were all just retrofit, were, for many of the theaters, not the quietest. They're a bit brute force. So if you take your show in the winter and you come back in the summer to check out the show, you might hear something a little bit different. And what's tricky, I think, for a lot of the theater shows that we're working on is you do try to connect the audience to the performance as much as possible. There is a bit of minimalist when it comes to dialogue scenes, or if it's a small, minimally amplified show. So that noise floor really starts to dictate where your threshold is. And if you imagine the peaks and valleys of normal program material, be it dialogue or music, the noise floor is like a rising tide that starts to overcome those peaks and valleys, specifically the valleys. And you start to have to make the decision of either bringing the entire level of the show up, or selectively bringing parts of the show up so as they don't dip below the noise floor, the rising floodwaters of the noise floor. What's a little bit tricky as well, specifically in a lot of the venues that we're working in, is that there's multiple rooms within your venue. And that means you've got the open orchestra level, you've got the under balcony level, and you've got the balcony levels. And with most of these noise pollutants, they're going to be localized. And it means that what you experience at the mix position, which is generally underneath the overhang, that can often be one of the quieter places in the theater. And as soon as you get out from under that overhang down in the orchestra level, you might hear more of the moving light rig. As soon as you go upstairs to the balcony, you're closer to the air vents in the ceiling. You might hear more of those blowers. So as an operator or a designer, you have a false sense of security being under the overhang at the console, and you think, yeah, we're definitely riding above this noise floor level. Everything seems intelligible. Everything seems appropriate. And then you get a complaint from the balcony that someone couldn't hear, and you might think, well, is it a system-related thing or something along those lines? But it ends up being that the air conditioning is just so loud, and you don't hear it downstairs. There are some under balconies where the HVAC is louder under the balcony. On Anastasia, I think we had that problem where the blowers were louder under the balcony, and the vents made a rushing air noise. So we thought it needed to be louder, but as you got out from under the balcony, it was a bit too loud in the front. So it's all these delicate decisions that need to be made on how to mitigate, and how do you keep your show sounding the way you wanted it when you first set it up, only to find that it's changed. Some of those decisions are political, and we'll oftentimes sit with a lighting designer and go through the lighting plot, and they certainly need the tools they need to make the show look appropriate, but there are often times where there can be a little bit of political influence to maybe choose a different fixture, or at least help them make decisions on where the quieter fixtures could be in the rig to help mitigate some of that noise in the house. Sometimes we will hang soft goods above the electrics or in the stage house. Some of the sets that we've worked on recently, they might not have many absorbing surfaces. They could be hard walls or plaster walls. Some of the plays are, single sets with they're an interior location, and they're going to be hard walls. And there might still be moving lights or projectors, because that's what we're into these days. And just putting some soft goods up there just gives a little bit of something to absorb. In the case of Frozen, we were actually able to get real acoustic absorbers put above the electrics, because there were so many moving lights, so many projectors, and a lot of the scenery was hard surfaces up in the flies. So decisions and discussions like that. We also work with building managers and facility managers to try to tame the air conditioning. In the case of Frozen, it was finding damper settings and ways to quiet the HVAC system in the St. James. They did a lot of work to help us out and make that quieter. I've done shows before where the director will ask for the HVAC to be turned off during a certain part of the show and for a very quiet, intimate moment. And so, you know, I think there's some interesting things to be said. While this slide is pulled up, I'll just talk a little bit briefly about, this is a slide from Frozen. And the other battle that we had, or conversation that we had, was fitting the PA into the room as well, and working with the acoustic recommendations that Roger was putting forward. But one thing that we knew in the St. James was there was very little proscenium space to fit a coherent PA without really having to divide it below the boxes and above the boxes. And in this particular theater, the opera boxes on the side come way out into the room. As you can see here, the existing box contour was where those opera boxes used to come out. And when you look on the plan view and you see the proscenium that was proposed, the show proscenium that was proposed to be added in, it really only gave us a very, very, very small sliver of real estate to fit the PA. And even then, we would be firing right into this box and not able to get great coverage. It also was a sightline issue and a number of other things for projection and lighting and patrons. So we had proposed either taking them out or cutting them back. And we were able to get approval from Disney to cut the boxes back. And you can see in this slide, this is after they had removed the landmarked plaster work from the front of the boxes, because the theater is a listed landmark in New York, and we had to petition to the Landmarks Commission as well. And all of that plaster has been saved, and it was put onto a truck, and it's in storage. And the theater owners can decide whether they want to restore after Frozen leaves the theater, or they can leave as is currently designed, and just, they have to keep the boxes in storage though. It's a landmark thing, so they can put them back in. But you'll see the original steel contour, and then the spray painted yellow line is where the new boxes were cut back to. And by doing that, we got a much clearer shot to the line array. It gave us the ability to have one coherent line array instead of multiple split top and bottom. And what's interesting about this is that there was enough interest by the producers and the director and the sound team to actually make something like this happen. And when we were able to present this to the theater owners and actually make it happen, it's quite remarkable, because there are many times where we don't have the resources and you just have to go along with what you can. But this particular situation, it worked out. There is a few other shows that have been able to do this. Mamma Mia was able to do it in the Winter Garden, and there's a few other examples of heavy theater modifications to make the sonic experience better. I think in general it helped a lot of other departments too, but we were sort of the original torchbearers. So, you know, every now and again, if you don't ask, you might not get it. So that's a good little story.
Awesome. Thanks, Merlijn, for being so amazing with that markup tool.
Yeah.
Trying to keep up.
I know you. I know we want to talk about Le Rev too a little bit, but I was going to ask Simon. Simon, you know, you've been working with Pete. I know you guys have been working together pretty much through your entire careers, but you've done some sound design work on your own, and just maybe talk a little bit about what you're trying to achieve when you're designing a show.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't do much sound design anymore. I work with Peter and occasionally others as a production engineer. I mixed for a long time. My last Broadway show mixing was Spider-Man. You know, I think one of the things that, as I've been sitting here thinking what I can contribute, I thought I want, you know, there are maybe people viewing, or maybe this is already a pretty knowledgeable group who's watching, but I think it's about what is theater acoustics? Why are they important? I think is one of the things that we may take for granted. And I was trying to think of a decent analogy. And to some degree, you know, when we talk about Frozen and the acoustics of the St. James, we had identified that as being 5 unique spaces. there was an orchestra level, front mezzanine, a rear mezzanine, a balcony. Front orchestra, rear orchestra, front mezzanine, rear mezzanine, and balcony. That's the audience spaces plus obviously a stage space. And I was thinking, what would be a decent analogy to talk about for theater acoustics in particular? And, you know, visually we talk about sight lines in the theater, things like a box might block a view, or a column, or do we, you know, when the scenery comes out into the space, what does that do to the visual of the play? But what does acoustics bring? And I think that acoustics are similar to sight lines, because we are, you know, it's the thing that can serve to cloud or enhance. There are going to be better spots and worse spots. And obviously through technology like electroacoustic modification, like Constellation, or through physical modification, we can sometimes bring change to a space. So I think that the importance of acoustics is an interesting topic, because we take for granted that we need it, but what does it do for us? And in some cases, I think that the importance of sound is to connect the audience to the performance. And we do that through amplification, through choices of reverberation or blend between the orchestra and the vocals, or within the vocals. So I think that, you know, what I try to achieve from an aesthetic perspective is an appropriate scale and an excitement, and to connect people to the performers. And sometimes that means being quiet, and sometimes it means being loud. But within an acoustic space, you know, the hard part is having a balance across all of these multiple rooms that we can identify in a theater. And I think that the side to that is that we are oftentimes working in spaces that were designed perhaps even 100 years ago. The St. James, as an example, is, I think it's almost at 100 years. And when you look at the places that we can put speakers, oftentimes that wouldn't have been a place that you would have had a performer before. So you end up with some very interesting reflections, as well as an incredible low end buildup. But so I think that's, I think that is trying to connect the audience through acoustics would be a good way to view this.
Absolutely, yeah. So Pete, when Rocky was in Germany, you had a chance to use a Constellation for that project, and was that really kind of, how did that help, or was that an effect, or was it more of a localization tool for the show in Hamburg?
It had an interesting evolution of its life. It started out as a solution to an overly dead theater, acoustically dead theater.
Right.
The Operettenhaus in Hamburg is a space that I had played with Fosse many, many years ago, like in the early 2000s, and it was pretty dead then. I can't remember if they actually deadened it even more, but by the time I went to do the site survey for Rocky, I watched the show in there, and it was evident that it was overly controlled. And it's a great space, but we started considering Constellation to help liven the room. It wasn't necessarily that we could have said, well, let's just take down some acoustic treatment. We didn't mind the control and the deadness in the room for the power of the rock and roll stuff, but we wanted to be able to give the room some life. So the first conversations were all about adding some controllable life to the room with the Constellation system. And as we started creatively developing the show, we realized that it was also an incredibly useful tool for specifically a production like that, where the change in location could be done by enveloping the audience in that same type of change. So certainly we had the Constellation system on at a medium type of setting as the audience was coming in. It really gave the room life. And the overture started, and it has all the brass fanfares and all that kind of stuff. And we actually kept Constellation on all the way up through the whole beginning part of the show, which was going through many different locations, but a lot of it was one song all the way through. And the action really didn't stop until a scenic unit rolled on that was a full-scale apartment that Rocky lived in. And we were following Rocky through this whole opening number of him down at the local gym, losing a fight and all this other stuff. And he comes home, he walks through the streets, and there's elevated trains, and there's still music. He walks in the door, he turns on his light, and he closes the door, and he's in his apartment. And as soon as he closed the door, we turned off Constellation. And it was the deadest room in the smallest apartment. And it was just us and him, and he starts to speak dialogue. And that's the first time you hear the room with no Constellation. So we were able to use it for things like that, but also fast forward into the end of the show, which takes place in a Madison Square Garden type arena, big final fight, and the set pushes out into.
Did we all lose Pete?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I can confirm that we lost Pete.
You lost me?
And now
you're back.
Hey, you're back.
You're back.
Oh, I don't know. It says my internet connection is unstable. So much like myself, my internet connection. So I was saying that the boxing ring would push out over the first 10 rows of audience, and they transplant those audience members up on the stage, which you can see in this slide here. And it became an all immersive event, and the lights were brought out into the house. You can see there are lights all the way around. There's video projection all the way around. There's Jumbotron comes down, and all of a sudden we're able to use Constellation as a tool to create a space larger than the theater that we're in, and really long first reflections and really long RT to make everything hang and give it that life. And it was really pretty cool to be able to play with that technology. We had two Dimitri systems, one which was just for the show, and then a second that was the Constellation permanently installed system. And we used OSC messages between the two systems to control the parameters of the Constellation. So it was a great way to use it both as a solution for helping the energy in the theater, but also then taking the bull by the horns and being able to use it as a creative tool as well. So that was definitely exciting.
I can personally attest how weird it is, because it's a conflict of the senses. You're visually aware of your surroundings, and suddenly there's this auditory explosion in volume, and your eyes are telling you that that's not possible. The room cannot possibly sound that cavernous. So once it happens, it's like it's I would call it four-dimensional, for lack of a better description.
Yeah, definitely. And having the ability to control that, and I think, as Lane was saying as well, you have all these different shows that can play in that space, and each show can sound different. You can creatively change it. You can turn it on and off throughout a show. You can just choose one setting and leave it on for the whole show. Using a tool like that can be very exciting, and it's sort of the opposite of how we use acoustic treatment or can be built upon, because you create control first by using acoustic treatment within the room, and then you put the Constellation system in to then modify in any way, shape, or form. So it gives you a great foundation.
I have a question, Peter, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, I think to tie the two things that we've been talking about, which is partly Constellation system and possibly noise floor, how did you negotiate where you put the mics for the Constellation system based on the inherent noise floor and moving lights, automation, and things in that show?
Well, a lot of it, we worked together quite extensively with the Constellation team, and had traded our drawings of where the main front firing system was going to live, and thought about where the microphones could then be. It does take a little bit of juggling when you're putting like we had line arrays, we had melody for that particular show. When you're putting a lot of energy into the room, you do have to consider what the microphones are hearing and how they're then regenerating that into the Constellation system. The other components being follow spots and projectors and things like that, which they don't want to have the microphones hanging in front of. But a lot of it was just talking through how we felt the show was going to operate, and the Constellation team advising us where we could then locate microphones that would be sort of out of the hotspot of the main firing range of the melody arrays or any other particular system that we had.
Right.
Well, I think also a little history on that theater is that has been a bit too dry for a lot of shows, and Constellation still is stayed after Rocky left, right?
Yeah.
Pete?
Yeah, it was a
Cool.
decision by the theater owner to actually pay for the installation. So the show itself consulted on it, and certainly we were using it for our purposes on the show. But when the show moved from Hamburg to Stuttgart, the Constellation system stayed. And it really was interesting because the director, Alex Timbers, who also directed Moulin Rouge and Beetlejuice, he became quite attached to that Constellation system. And when we got to Stuttgart and didn't have it, it really, it changes the energy of the show. You're used to feeling the show and having the room be alive. And it became a challenge for us to try to replicate it in ways that are, what Constellation does is not something that you can just easily replicate, with a reverb processor. But it became one of our tasks to try to figure out, well, how do we at least make it somewhat comparable? And it never has the same life, and certainly it never had the same ability to regenerate energy in the room of audience reaction, of the way we used it in the beginning of the show and turning it off when we come into Rocky's apartment. We just couldn't do any of that the same way. So you rarely get a chance in what we do to be able to compare an A/B comparison of, well, what if we had it and what if we didn't? But we certainly got that comparison, and it was a wide-eyed awakening.
So since Merlin's doing such an amazing job at randomizing the slides, there's a couple other shows like King Kong or Le Rêve is obviously more of a spectacular, a Franco Dragón show that runs in Las Vegas that you're the designer for, and or King Kong, which ran in Australia first, I believe, and then found its way to New York after many years. Which would you rather look at?
Well, I can talk a little about Le Rêve, and then maybe Simon wants to talk a little about King Kong, because he was with us for both Australia and New York, and there's a couple of slides that I think could be interesting to talk about.
Great.
So acoustically, Le Rêve was a show that was running at the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas for about a year before I became involved. And once I got there, they were doing a big revamp of the show and new lighting, and they redesigned the theater, all sorts of change that occurred. But as far as the acoustics in the space, it's a very, very, very voluminous room. Above that curtain, spoiler alert, above that curtain, which you'll see maybe in another photograph, perhaps, maybe not, that curtain goes away in the opening of the show in a very dramatic fashion, spoiler alert. And it's above, there are fly gantries that allow performers to descend and do acrobatic tricks and dive into the water. That's a 1 million-gallon swimming pool in the middle that has lifts and divers and all sorts of things like that. But the volume of this room became overwhelming in some ways. So a lot of the way that the PA is designed was really to make sure that we were putting energy into the room in the right direction. And as we were sitting and watching the original version of the show and experiencing the theater, what became interesting is this giant room with an in the round configuration. It seats about 2,000 people, which it looks much, much larger, but it's only a 2,000 seat theater, and it's in the round. So you sit and you watch the show, and someone would dive, 80 feet down into this pool, and it's so impressive, and the audience would go crazy, and they would clap and respond, and it sounded like there were 20 people sitting around you, at a bar watching a club act, and you thought, that's the audience reaction that trick just got? We started to think about it and realized that because the audience is separated in this room and spread out in the round configuration of a giant room, you actually couldn't experience the 2,000 people that were sitting in the room appreciating what they just watched. And so we proposed a Constellation system, and this was actually the very first Constellation branded system that I had worked with Meyer on. Before that, it was VRAS. So the main idea of using the Constellation in that room was to help lift the audience energy and to help it elevate the experience that the audience was having. Now, once you have that tool, we were able to use it for a number of other things. Also, there are moments in the show where none of the performers that are performing acrobatics are wearing microphones. So there are some clowns that in the original version of the show, they don't speak words, but they emote sound to perform their act, and they weren't wearing any microphones. So we used the Constellation as a sort of a voice lift type of thing for that. It gave a life to the room, but also we would turn it on and off for the audience reaction. There were a couple numbers where we used like a cathedral setting for a number that was called La Chapelle, which was kind of like a Sistine Chapel sort of thing. But it again was born of one idea and then quickly integrated into the show in a number of different ways. And it's still in use today. We put that system in quite a long time ago. You can actually see that the Constellation system in the rack is LX300 based.
Right.
And the main
two consoles running on Dimitri.
Yeah. So we actually had the original system in the room was LX300 based, and when we redid the system, we sent those original LX300 frames back to Meyer, had them reconfigured and set up to be a Constellation system, and then we replaced the main show system with the Dimitri and Q console setup. So that's why there's that hybrid of frames. They already owned LX300 and many more frames of LX300. So we turned that into the Constellation. So it's two separate rigs, two separate systems rather, that are then combined to go to the loudspeakers. You could actually turn off the Dimitri system and just have Constellation on in the room if you wanted to. Yeah.
Awesome. So King Kong, Simon, and then we're going to take some questions. So after that.
I think King Kong. We had done King Kong in Australia at the Regent Theater, and I think that was in about 2014, 15. I think is around the time, and that was a really interesting experience. We went into that knowing a lot of things. We headed down to Australia to start working on this project, and at that point, Peter had not fully come to the idea of what King Kong's voice was. And among other things, in that, the things that you could predict before you got there was, he's large. You were going to need to have some amount of support for his gravity. And, this doesn't play much into the idea of acoustics, but in terms of system, I think one of the most interesting things that we had come up with was we had in Melbourne, Australia, we had subwoofer arrays that were on their end 700 HPs, 5 tall. So I think that was about 24 feet tall, 24-foot tall columns. There they are hidden above. You can see that some of them were stacked amongst on top of each other. The bottom one sort of sat on the ground. Inside that, to the right-hand side, you can see that the proscenium. So that would have been the house left side, and then the silver was an Art Deco proscenium, and we had some melody arrays that were hidden inside. Normally, in show conditions, there was a scrim in front of that, so it created a more complete proscenium picture. But what the arrays of subs gave us the ability to do was to tilt the subwoofer energy up. We were able to, through some delay techniques, we were able to sort of modify the beam steering of that array, which was a great benefit to us, because normally once you end up with a lot of hot spots in low end in a theater, and we were able to sort of get some of that energy up into the back of the balcony, which wouldn't have had really much energy at all. That show also had hot off the presses two 1100 LFCs, four 1100 LFCs, sorry, that we put in a linear array across the front edge of the stage to sort of round out the low end. So we had a really excessive amount of speakers in theatrical terms, but we were able to give King Kong his gravity and allow every paw movement to have a have a meaning. That show, notably, we had both in Australia and then ultimately New York, we had a separate sound effects operator who was taking visual sound effects cues for every paw movement. Everything King Kong did was scripted. He didn't move his paw by chance. So when the show came to New York, the Art Deco proscenium went away, but we did continue the idea of large subwoofer arrays. And for New York, we had 900 LFCs in a gradient cardioid arrangement on each proscenium. And
you can almost see the bottoms of them in that photograph that's on the screen right now, Simon, all the way up.
Oh yeah.
Just above that, there's a person's head.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, those are the
speakers are hard to photograph in the theater.
Yeah. Just above the lighting designer's head, there's the bottom of the subwoofers, and then next to it are the arrays.
The subwoofer arrays for that were larger physically than the main proscenium arrays, which were leopards in this case in New York. So through each of those experiences, we needed to have that gravity added to King Kong, and it was they're great tools for us to be able to do that in those subwoofer lines. The 900s were, I think it was probably, and Pete can correct me if my memory is wrong on this, but it was really one of the on Broadway we end up having quiet time sessions where everybody else is left, and that's the time that we get to listen to the system, align it, and get our jump start on what the show is going to sound like. And I remember that we had it was a nice big room. It was in the Broadway Theater, which is a nice big theater, and the sound system was really able to sort of breathe. But I remember we turned on the subwoofers, and because it was the first time it was like, right, this is what subwoofers do. Oftentimes we have to put the subwoofers in very compromised locations on a house box somewhere or under the stage, and it creates a really sort of imbalanced experience. And this was this time where it was like, we just turned them on. It was like, wow, that is a great place to start from. It was a really exciting experience. John, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, I think so. I have one last question for the three of you, and then we're going to open it up to people who are logged in right now. Was there one show in your career that changed your life to this point in your career?
Who's going first?
Oh man, I guess I'll start. I guess there have been several, and in different ways, but in terms of sound design, one of the most moving points in sound design on a show that I've worked on was Sten Severson designed Hair, which actually was in the St. James as well. And at the end of the show, there's sort of a procession where all of the actors walk out into the house and then exit out of the back of the theater. And as they exit, it just gets more and more reverberant until it sounds like, it sounded like you were in a cathedral. And it was just like, it was one of the most moving sound design moments that I've ever experienced, because it was, you knew that there was sound happening, but it was so actor driven, and it ended the show. So I think that's mine.
Perfect.
I don't want to follow Pete, so I'm going to jump in. I'm sure his is going to be super cool.
I don't know.
No pressure.
It's a good question, but I don't think that I can limit it down to a show that has, I can pick out a few moments from history, from things that I will say as an audience member, I tend to be in awe of whatever's happening. Even you go and see a show and you're like, how did they know they were going to sing there? I can't believe somebody knew to turn on their microphone. I mean, it's sort of like I can remove myself from the technology in some ways. I think that as an audience member, I had seen Sunset Boulevard in London back, it was for my honeymoon, which was a very long time ago. And it was just the most stunning sound I'd ever heard. It was so minimalist. Peter had been working with Martin Levan for a number of years at that point. He wasn't working on that, but I just thought, wow, this is, a really incredible sound. The excitement of the orchestra, it just all sounded so real and powerful. And then I, at that point was young and, looking around at all the technology, and it was just so small. And I thought, I don't understand how it works. Similarly, I remember also Peter had been working on Ragtime in New York, and I remember I was mixing the revival of 1776, and on a night off, we got to go see the invited dress rehearsal for Ragtime. And I just thought, what an incredible piece of theater. That show was unbelievable. It sounded great. It was the first time putting it in front of an audience. Obviously, when you put theater friends in an audience, it can be more electrifying, but it was a stunning show. I always remember this one, it's a really small, maybe trivial moment, but I had mixed the revival of Into the Woods in about the 2000 with Vanessa Williams. And I remember there was one moment in the show when she would be, where she would be singing Children Would Listen. And if just the reverb was just right and everything was just right, you would get goosebumps. And it didn't happen every night. And it's the ephemeral aspect of what we do, capturing that, lightning in a jar. And I don't know, and it wasn't just one time, it would happen, but everything had to be just right. Just the right reverb, just the right balance, the tempo, the players. So those are the things that I remember. I don't think I can say that one thing has changed my life, but there's so many small things that have informed, my thought process, and working with Pete and our thought process about all the different shows that we've worked on. So I can't say there's one, but it's made up of a million.
Yeah, that's great. A great answer, Simon. Yeah.
And you can tell when the audience feels it too.
In
those moments, it's great. It's the best.
Totally.
Yeah. I would, there's a picture of younger me. I would go along with what Simon was saying, because originally when John asked the question, I said, well, there really isn't one. I mean, if I'm being truthful, the show that really changed my life, growing up in Connecticut, there was a little summer stock theater, and my parents would take me there to see shows. And it was close enough to New York that they were doing really great caliber productions, equity performers, union musicians, the whole thing. And the stagecraft was fantastic. And the sound was also a great aspect of that. And I remember I had been dabbling in sound a bit. I was pretty young, maybe 12 or 13 or so. And I went to see a production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And I happened to be sitting near the console, not at the console, but just next to it. And it was an old Soundcraft 800B. And I watched the operator mixing the show, maybe more than I watched the show at that point. But that was the moment where I said, I could do this. This is cool. Like that is really interesting. Watching hearing the results, hearing the way the audience was reacting to the performance. So that was probably a show that changed my life, because that launched me on a path that arrived me here. But as far as designing, that's where I have to agree with Simon. Every show, there's a lesson, there's a takeaway, whether it's a play or a style of show you've done a million times. You're always learning. And something like Le Rêve, Le Rêve was the first show that was not a Broadway style musical that I had designed. And you immediately learn that there are no boundaries. There is no rule. The script doesn't say, and then someone walks into this location and they do these things, and these hard, fast rules have to apply to what the sound is. It was absolute sky's the limit creativity of how would you mix this music and put it into this room? What do you want to do creatively? What is your statement audibly? All through music. There are shows that challenge us sound effects wise. There are, so every show there's new things to learn. And certainly I think Simon and I can both attest, I'm sure Lane's in this also, is you never stop learning. You never stop realizing that there's more to experiment with and try. No matter how many times you do it, you build a bigger toolbox, but you never stop learning.
Those are great answers by everyone. Okay, Merlijn, it's all yours and questions. This has been amazing.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Also with the goosebump factor, which is
and by the way, sub-steering is something that Merlijn is very passionate about. If you don't know Merlin's background. So Simon, I'm sure you made his day.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
I'm sure he would have been horrified at what we had done.
Oh, no.
Oh, I'm sure.
We'll discuss that over beers one day, hopefully.
Okay.
In 3D space. That was awesome. For those that are joining us, if you have any questions for these panelists, by all means, make use of the chat function and let us know.
Is that the real McCoy asking a question?
Kevin.
So
Can I just say one quick thing, because this is Kevin? So I mentioned this on Monday, but my first tour was with Kevin McCoy, and it was a Peter Hylenski design. So
wow,
that's all I have to say.
We're all connected.
Worlds collide.
So please allow me to read out the question loud. Are there any tricks or stories about things that you might do to control or enhance the acoustic energy coming from an orchestra pit or a band on stage?
Who wants to take it? I can speak a little, and then
sure.
Tips and tricks. There's no such thing as a stupid acoustic solution, so you just got to try them. I've done everything from a little bit of light baffling around things to full drum booths. As Kevin knows, he was on tours that I've designed where we had drum booths. But I've also done things like Motown London is a good example. So Motown New York, when we did the show in New York, the stage overhung the pit quite a lot. And we had good control. We did acoustic treatment in the pit and designed a drum booth, but also the brass were controlled with a wall, and they were largely covered from the overhang. The particular theater in New York also didn't have like a proscenium reflector or a balcony reflector, whereby you have the acoustic arch over the proscenium that takes the sound from the pit and launches it back out. When we did the show in London, it was an older theater and it did have the reflector. The stage did not overhang the pit as much, and the brass were out in the open. And that was a show where there could be tunes that the brass are blowing the whole time, and you had to try to keep the brass in check when you wanted to make it underscore, let's say, a novel concept to be able to control the level. So we ended up building these, it was almost like a louvered shelter over the top of the brass section. It didn't really have sides or walls. We had a little bit of front protection only to keep the brass from the players that were sitting in front of them, but mostly it was to keep the sound from getting up into that reflector but still give life to it. So we didn't want to enclose them in. And it was just made out of unistrut and acoustic panels that we came up with. And it did a great trick. So sometimes it's local treatment. Sometimes it's how you lay out the band in the pit. But there's no such thing as a stupid solution. I've been in regional theaters where we had a very limited run. It didn't have to be something that was set up permanently. And we would just find some odd bits and pieces and make something to tame a reflection, or, you know, so it could be anything.
You know, it's nice working in as a supervisor at a theater, because you get to work with lots of different designers. And I've definitely noticed a trend over, I mean, I guess from the beginning is that more designers are starting to put completely isolate bands, or almost completely isolate bands. You know, I mean, certainly since sound technology has gotten better, you know, before that it would be in the pit and everything would be acoustic. And it does seem like the bands are retreating further and further into complete isolation. Do you feel like that is a trend you've seen as well, Peter?
Well, I think I don't want to jump the next question here, but because I have my chat window open, I see that Christine
the scenic design, yeah, right,
about collaboration on a typical show between the sound and set design. And I know that Simon and I experience this all the time, and it's evident in King Kong, and evident in Moulin Rouge, and evident in Frozen. But
I think we've only done one show with an open pit. Anastasia was our only open pit in the last, I don't know, 8 years.
Yeah,
not by our choice.
Oh, wow.
So the scenic designer is hired sometimes before the sound designer, oftentimes before the sound designer, but certainly their work starts before ours does. The first thing that has to happen is we need to have the setting. Oftentimes that's what we're handed. We are given a set design that says, guess what? The set's coming out over the orchestra pit, and that's how it's going to be. It's not something that and a lot of people think that we do. Sometimes we do, but a lot of people will say, oh, well, why did the sound designer choose to cover up the pit and put the band somewhere else? Most often we haven't made that decision. It's been made for us. So,
or I should say that the other trend I've seen is that scenic designers really like to sort of spread the band out over the whole stage, or like put them out into the house, which is definitely a completely different challenge. And
those decisions are oftentimes made before we're completely on board, or it could be something that they say, it's not necessarily a huge negative. They might say, hey, check it out. This is what we're thinking. It could be cool if we could see the band back there, but in order to make it work, we have some people over here and some people over there, and how do we make that work? Those are all challenges that we have to work with. I do think that the benefit of the closed pit scenario for a lot of the style of shows that we've been doing recently, it does lend itself to being able to have a lot of control over the music, and connecting it back to the initial discussion of acoustics in theater. So much of what we do in musical theater is connecting the musicians in the pit with the audience as well. And for a long while, it was based on the style of music. So if it was traditional book musical and the drums were open and the brass was open, it was fine, but it was written in a certain way. And nowadays, the modern musicals that are being written, the underscore is a rock and roll song, and people are supposed to be talking about what they had for breakfast while the entire band is playing fortissimo. And so if you don't have a way of controlling that, you can try to speak with the music department and say, why don't we bring this down to pianissimo? And they'll say, yeah, but it's not going to have the same vibe anymore. And that's where the control becomes important. So I think it's a double-edged sword, but yeah.
Do you think writers and composers are now writing shows based on that idea that they can do that, whereas, you know, in the past they wouldn't have been able to do that?
Yeah.
I think that, oh, sorry, Pete.
I was going to say, what do you think, Simon?
I mean, I think there's the two things. The answer Lane's question. I think we can sort of define there being two sides of a musical experience in theater. There are songs where the music accompanies the vocal, and then there is music that the vocal is intended to be sung on top of, and you might have a trumpet or a guitar playing along the same melody with a vocal, or in competition, and that would be sort of a more pop style experience. In most pop music, you don't have the the music duck out and go to an umchuck. You can think of, I always think about, I'm not going to sing it for you, but the song in South Pacific, There's Nothing Like a Dame. You get the sung line and then you get an orchestrated line, and they trade off. Modern theater, that type of orchestration doesn't happen that often. It doesn't never happen, but it is, the technology has allowed composers and orchestrators and arrangers to rethink how music accompanies the voice. Something like Motown is a good example, where it wasn't written for theater. It was written as pop music, and it was written to be recorded and then ultimately performed, but it wasn't a strict arrangement in terms of accompanying the voice. So I think we can define musical theater as having sort of those two poles, and everything moves between them. But going back to covered orchestra pits, I think that what we've noticed is, or I've noticed, is there's a trend that I like to call it's the 3D of theater. We just keep bringing the performers closer to the audience. And it's very exciting, and it is what I think a lot of audiences are expecting now and are enjoying. It makes it incredibly difficult to provide cohesive amplification. Once you start moving the performer inside the PA, it gets very difficult. But it also means, if we go back to the show Bullets Over Broadway, the entirety of the orchestra was in a room that was designed, and in the trap room, a room was built. It was below the stage. We had to contend with scenery rolling on top of it. There was a lot of tap dancing in that show. So we knew that we needed it to be as isolated as we could from the performers upstairs, because we didn't want to have the sound of, stomping tap dancing coming back through all the orchestra mics. And in that case, the conductor was also totally removed, and that was a fairly classic style musical. And that would not have been a style that we would have chosen to not have the band present in the house. There is, even if they're present only a small amount, they add a life to it. And we go through, the few shows that I'm remembering it now. We then did Something Rotten, which was a mostly closed pit, again in the St. James. We had the stage came over it, and the conductor was there, and we had convinced them to put some gratings on each side that we called the jelly beans, because they were sort of kidney shaped like a jelly bean, to allow some of the acoustic energy to come out of the pit. And we had actually had some source speakers mounted below those cutouts, so that if we wanted to sort of enhance the acoustic energy to come out of the pit, we could. But the conductor was visible. Frozen at the St. James, the band is all of the instruments that make sound, except for the strings. The strings could be heard a very small amount acoustically through the opening that the conductor played in. But there was a while where the conductor wasn't going to be part of the experience in the house. That show is also notable because the drums, bass, guitar, and percussion are actually nearly underneath the back of the theater. It's not a very deep orchestra section, but they're remoted. 4 rooms for them, and then there are 3 rooms in the orchestra pit and the conductor. So we have all of those acoustic spaces, and those were really, we had brought in an acoustic consultant for that, right, Pete, to help us come up with how that might work.
That was actually the second collaboration. The first, John Storick is a friend of mine, and John and I did, I think the first job we worked on together was 54 Below, which is a musical, like a nightclub kind of thing in New York with live performance venue. And we worked together on that and became friends there. And when Bullets Over Broadway came to be, and again, the edict came down that the pit was not, it was going to be lifts, scenic lifts, and not an orchestra there. Find somewhere else to put all those people. We called up John. So John designed the Bullets Over Broadway room. And then when we started working on Frozen and saw that it was going to be another enclosed space, and we were going to need to build studio rooms and all other sorts of crazy stuff. We worked together with Walter Stork Design Group on that as well, and it was incredibly successful. It really gave us the best possible acoustic solution. So yeah.
We
Excellent.
continuing on. Oh, go ahead. Was that a question?
No.
Oh,
it's
so
yours.
we, notably, we then did the next one that comes to mind might not be the next show, but when we had done King Kong, that was again one of the moments in that production. There are many electrifying moments, but one of the moments is King Kong is in the theater, and he could sort of play within an area on the stage, but they hook him up to some points that come down from the proscenium in the house, and he could basically overhang the first 3 rows of the audience, and he would sniff and roar, and it was really electrifying, which meant that we couldn't have a conductor in a hole in the center of the orchestra. They were, by and large, there were a couple of percussion and drum room off to the side, but by and large, the orchestra was contained in the pit below them. Again, every time it's a double-edged sword. You gain some control, but you also have to make sure that the sound of the pit itself, the acoustic in the pit, doesn't just sound like they're in a bathroom. So we go to great lengths to try to figure out how to make the space that the musicians are playing in sound good. We also can run into some issues with having just too much volume. When you put brass players, you put 6 brass players into a small space, they can overwhelm themselves with volume, and then they can't hear themselves play. I mean, it's sort of the snowball rolls down the hill. And then Moulin Rouge is also a situation, and as you saw in the slides, the performance space is the space. There is a stage. But you are intended to feel like you're in the nightclub or in the theater that is the Moulin Rouge. And that was when we had done the production in Boston out of town, the orchestra was in a room that was essentially actually a separate building physically, though it was part of the same building. It was just subterranean, but it was really physically past the main structural wall of the theater. And when we came to New York, there was talk of trying to put them into the pit, and we did all the measurements we could, but we ended up building, again, a room in the trap room that is an acoustic environment for the band to play in that isolates them from the mechanical noises of the lifts and the wardrobe people and the sound people and everybody doing their jobs backstage underground. There's also basically as far away as you could get from that room is another room that has the four wind players, the trumpet, trombone, horn, and reed player. And they're located in the very back behind the top of the balcony. There's a room that has a window to the street, and they're up there. And then the conductor is located so in that case, they're located in a small sort of dugout. But having all of those, the choice isn't necessarily ours to where the band goes. We try to make the best of it, but something like Moulin Rouge, it really works. I think it's having isolated drums and isolated strings allows Pete to do his magic maybe even better on a show like that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Would you agree, John?
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's an interesting question which goes, do you consider a separate LCR system for voice-only reproduction to gain clarity and linearity?
Lane,
Well,
do you I can answer, or Simon or Lane?
Well, I'll throw this. There are 3 basic system configurations that Broadway shows have existed in over the years. One would be, even though we end up with some stereo imaging, essentially a distributed mono system, even if you have a left, center, right component, meaning a left proscenium, right proscenium, cluster, front fill delays, that would be your standard configuration for sort of minimum reinforcement. Another configuration has been a split band vocal system where you have all of those speakers for the vocals, and then you have chosen to have an additional system that is in a physically different location, maybe wider or narrower or on stage, off stage, but is the band system. Typically, you would end up sharing some other speakers like your delay lines, and that would give you, so that gives you, I don't know if I would say that a separate LCR system for clarity, that adds a little separation to the, between the voice and the band, and has been, I think, very successful. I think Pete had done it on Sweet Cherry, if my memory serves correctly.
You are correct.
Years ago. And then the third system, which doesn't happen often anymore, is a what we call a split A/B system. And that, what that means is there are physically and literally two completely separated systems, A and B, but they shared real estate. So we would, the last time we had that system, we had put it into the St. James for Sideshow. So you would, on a proscenium where you have one speaker, you have a mirror, a parallel speaker right next to it. And that system is what we put that in because in theater mixing, when you have two microphones on two different performers, the microphone doesn't know that it should only pick up the performer that's wearing it. So you have what we call phasing, right, which is essentially where the signal from the other person comes into your microphone at a lower level but delayed. So obviously with a split distance, we gain a sort of a flangey, phasey component. And this happens mostly because you're using their microphone, the other person's microphone, and combining them electrically. It turns out if you combine them acoustically, where they go through completely discrete electrical paths, that is dramatically minimized. It doesn't make it nothing, but when we had done Sideshow, Pete had decided, you know, I think we need to do an A/B system. They're conjoined twins. They're going to sing in each other's face. And it was literally magic during the first 5 seconds of rehearsal when they turned to each other's faces and just started singing. And it sounded like, whoa, this is pretty great. But within that, I think that those would be the three reasons you would do it. I know that in history,
we've done all of them. I mean, we've
done all of them. Yeah,
we've done all of them. And I think, and the question asking if it's, would you consider it for clarity and linearity? Those are a lot of the reasons I think that some of these systems were developed. Is the idea of, I mean, you could even take it back to maybe John and Merlijn can talk about this, but like the wall of sound idea, wasn't it like the bass comes
separate
from
instruments,
all the speakers, like each instrument has a place, and that's sort of
it was a big ABCD system.
Yeah, and that's sort of the idea, was that you are asking the reproduction of sound to be really localized for what that speaker can do. So instead of trying to do the bass and the vocal and the guitar, it was one pure thing. So one instrument was here. And we actually, Jonathan Deans actually had come up with a concept that we used on Fosse, where the proscenium was a ring of speakers all the way across and down. And we zoned it and had different instruments coming from different zones. And it does give a different size and a different scale, mostly because the sound is no longer coming from one point source. So this idea of clarity and linearity, it certainly can be a benefit, I think. And some of the systems that we've done that were a split band vocal, they give you it's a different result. The way the soundscape, the way that your audible picture is in front of you feels different. And you can do that by moving the speakers away. Maybe they're not right next to each other. Sometimes they are, but it gives you a different feel. And I won't dispute that there's some cool stuff that happens with the split systems. You need a lot more equipment, but that's not a bad thing.
I believe the last time I was at the Kennedy Center, they still had A/B underbalks. Like it was one box that had two separate inputs. And
in one of those theaters they do. Yeah. Right.
And all the A/B stuff really started with Martin Levon, and Martin had had sort of pioneered a lot of this idea of what if it were two speakers, and we did the as Simon was explaining, the acoustic combining instead of the electrical combining. And so a lot of that, they used to take, for the delay systems that we used to put in on a lot of shows, there would be like JBL Control 1s, and they'd have two of them together on one mount. And if it was a really small delay coverage area, we had Bose AM5s. And if you remember those, they had two little tiny cells. They were wired together internally, but you could put them on your bookshelf and turn them and get a little bit wider pattern. We would take them and rewire them so that one would be an A speaker and one would be a B speaker. So you'd hang them under your under balcony with two elements. And then eventually people began developing A/B speakers. And I think Steve Kennedy maybe had an EAW box that was like, I don't remember the model number, but it was basically like a JF80 times 2, and it was super wide, but it was two of them inside of it.
That's what's at the Kennedy Center is double jam 60s, I believe.
Yeah.
Right,
I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff like that. I mean, Steve was doing AB for a long while too, and there's some great stuff there.
And even if it's not completely separate boxes, I mean, a lot of the sound designers I see will have primarily vocals in the center cluster, and then maybe have some band reinforcement, and then much more band coming from left and right than vocals, and maybe just filling in. Like I know if I'm tuning a system, I'll just kind of fill in a little bit of vocals in the side, but have the primary energy coming from, vocals coming from the center. And that really helps with imaging too. I mean, I found it makes it a lot easier to understand the vocals if the band is more coming from the sides, for especially those moments where there's a lot of band energy and the vocals are trying to get over it, and the vocals are coming right from the middle. And you can, you image to the actor better that way too.
Absolutely. There are some tricky things, when you do like a band vocal split system. The tricky thing is making sure that in every seat in the house, you can hear the same relationship between the band and the vocal. And that's the only rub, is you got to really pay special attention, especially as you get down close to the proscenium on far left and right, where you have a different relationship between those loudspeakers, making sure that it feels the same there as when you get back into the main focus of the PA. So I think it's an interesting concept, but it is one of those things where as soon as you start splitting your system in different ways, you got to make sure that it always sounds correct, and the balance between the vocals and the band are the same everywhere in the room.
And I'll say in the Rhoda, which is our larger space that primarily does it does most of the musicals. We do have sort of the main left and right system, and then additional fills, UPMs or whatever the designer wants, that are sort of literally right next to the main left and right, that do that additional vocal fill, so they can have completely separate audio. I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. And I think this is the Matrix and Galaxy and the Matrix and Dimitri. It really gives you that control to be able to fine tune and figure out exactly how much. And sometimes even if you're up in the balcony, connecting this back to the acoustic discussion, if you're up in a balcony and you've got that reflector that's taking your band and dumping it in the balcony, there are many times where I'll say, well, I don't need as much band in the balcony, but I need to keep those vocals going. And so you go to the Matrix and you take some band out of the Matrix to make sure that your blend is still sounds appropriate. So it's pretty cool.
Guys, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I think we hit all the points, and really kind of covered a wide range of what this topic was about, and hit it in many different ways. So I really appreciate your time today in making that happen. And thank you everybody for attending. I'm going to hand it back to Merlijn.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Close it out and talk about Friday as well.
And thanks, you, John, my co-host. Thank you to you as well. So yeah, Friday. What do we want to lift a tip of the veil?
Yeah, we're going to be on Friday. We have Jonathan Deans joining us, so he'll be on the he'll be our guest on Friday's webinar.
All right, that's
awesome.
Cool.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, guys. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. As always, this webinar within a couple of hours will be available on our YouTube channel, Thinking Sound. So be sure to visit our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or want to watch any of the other webinars on theater sound. And that means that without further ado, please stay safe, please stay healthy, and best to you and your loved ones. See you Friday. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.